Hello and welcome to What's My Tagline. I'm your host, Carol Flagg. Thanks for tuning in. On this show, we put our microphone in front of a variety of industry experts to understand the factors influencing messaging, branding, social media, and online reputation in healthcare. You can follow the conversation on Twitter at hashtag What's My Tagline, and be sure to follow me at Carol Flagg. My guest today is healthcare marketer, brand builder, and founder of Altura Digital, Jared Johnson. Jared is also the host of the popular podcast Healthcare Rap and also author of Connect the Docs, Put Digital Health into Practice. Jared, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Carol, for having me on. It's an honor.
Oh, we've been trying to put this together for a while. I tell people who is sort of in my circle of whatever influence I might have that I first saw you. I didn't meet you, but I first saw you at the HitMate conference 2 years ago, where you did literally a healthcare rap session with one of our other hosts, Matt Fisher of Healthcare Du Jour.
Indeed, yes. That was a little bit outside of our comfort zones as well, but I'm telling you, that was a lot of fun.
It was really charming, and I can see why you have a podcast called the Healthcare Rap, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But my first question of all my guests, as you probably know, is if you had to describe yourself as a tagline, what would it be?
So great question, and I think just the setup itself. I mean, this is such a fun program to be a part of, and I've been thinking about this a lot. Like I said, we've had a little bit of extra time to kind of put this together, and I'm thinking back. I think my answers probably changed 3 different times, even in the last few days. So if I think of it differently, I'm just going to go with this one anyway, because that's a loaded question to me. I feel like there's a lot of different ways I could go with it. But here's where I'm thinking right now. I feel like my emphasis, I feel like one thing that I talk about a lot is just really how to make healthcare marketing better. I feel like we've gone through a period of recognizing that the way we market, like what we market and how we market it, just isn't keeping up with what's actually resonating with people. And so my tagline actually for healthcare marketing is kind of what my tagline I feel like is for myself these days, which is help and hope, not hype. And to me, that's what I feel like we should be marketing in healthcare. I feel like we do ourselves a disservice if we just feel like all we have to do is the old traditional means of trying to get in front of people and reach brand awareness versus actually being relevant with our brands. And so me personally, this is kind of my approach, my philosophy towards things. I feel like what should we be marketing in healthcare? Absolutely is things that should be helpful to patients. They should also be helpful to providers, and we should be offering hope. There are so many detractors out there. There's so many naysayers out there. I try my best. I'm not always successful, but I try to keep a positive spin. I try to focus on the parts. Excuse me. I try to focus on the parts that I feel like are working with this transformation of healthcare that's happening. And so there's the hope part and there's the help part. Then there's what we, I guess, used to have as our definition of marketing, which was the big hype machine, right? Like, let's just do whatever we need to get in front of people. Let's put a bunch of pop-ups and banner ads, and let's just get things in front of people, and they'll respond. And we're seeing that shift. We're right in the middle of that shift. It's not completely shifted yet, but the shift away from that type of thought of how do we approach marketing, of just getting our name and our brand in front of people and with a lot of hype that's hollow and actually doesn't help them at all. There's so much we could do with our marketing in healthcare to connect people with the answers they need about their health. It might be connecting them with care that they need, and so we need to make sure that our information, that our data about a provider or about a solution or a piece of technology that can make life better for people, let's make sure it's accurate. Like let's do something that portrays that helpfulness and the hope behind it. So I'll land on that one, help and hope, not hype.
I think that is really interesting that you're bringing this up in the conversation, as we're going to talk a little bit about your background and how you got into doing some of the things that you did, especially the book that you wrote and your podcast. The industry obviously it's right. Taking a beating out there is kind of brutal because there is obviously in the media every day and certainly from a news cycle and whatnot. People people perhaps aren't as hopeful about what their health care and treatment is going to look like, in the future, right? They deal with these daily challenges and, obviously high deductibles and uncertainty and, so the message perhaps isn't so positive. And so I think what I'm hearing is, you can't be about the hype because, people are kind of past that. And now they're really looking for, how can you truly help me?
Absolutely. You're spot on. And there used to be not much of an intersection between what's good for patients and what's good for the business, to grow the business.
Yeah.
And the fact is now those two, if it's like a big Venn diagram in the sky, there's kind of a bigger intersection of those two pieces, because when we do things right, when we actually are helpful, when we provide answers or we connect someone to the care they need, they have a positive brand impression and we actually provide some relevance in their life. And that wasn't always the case. It did used to be focused on just do whatever it takes to make people feel like that we're a big deal. And what time has chosen, what time has shown is that has just eroded trust even more. And you're right. Some of the stats out there lately are about, I think it's in the 70-something% of people just feel like hospitals and health systems, providers in general, put profits before patients.
Right.
That's so that's a fully realized lack of trust. So if all we do is put noise out there or something that causes that trust to be eroded even more by being inauthentic, then we're actually not growing our business. It could be a short-term gain. We could kind of maneuver our way into getting somebody onto a list or nurturing them into our funnel and go down that path. But we're not actually creating any kind of brand relevance with them. So I see that intersection as kind of the ultimate goal for marketing, and that's why when you do one, you actually do both. I just feel like there's more of an intersection than there used to be.
Yeah, that's a great point. So tell us a little bit about your background. How I'm presumably you were a marketer first and then went into healthcare, or you were in healthcare and then went into marketing.
Marketer first. So I started out in public education, actually. So
I did not know that.
Yeah, first few years of my career. So it was back in the days when digital really wasn't a thing yet. We didn't call it that. At most, you were called web marketing, and that was part of what I was doing. I'd be involved in PR and Marcom type activities as well. Then I got my first healthcare related position was about 13 years ago. It was with a small community hospital in the Dallas area in Texas, and we had a small team, and that's where I really learned that I enjoyed being around healthcare going on. I really enjoyed seeing the difference in quality of life that it brought to people, and so I had to figure out what my part in that was. And at that hospital, it was mostly website activities. We redesigned our site and so forth. And so that was before the days of social media. Then I've spent a few years in the medical device world with a couple of different large and small medical device manufacturers for about 7 years, I believe. So that was more the B2B space. We were marketing to providers, and that's where I learned, what providers care about. They absolutely don't buy the hype of anything. It's a very evidence-based.
They're very cynical for the most part.
Yes, and I also learned that what worked for one didn't necessarily work for another one. And those were the days when social media was starting to come around, and so I'd be the one. I was kind of in a web marketing role. I cut my teeth creating and designing and developing content as much as I could. So some days I was the one up there with code up on the screen trying to debug code. And then at the same time, I have a marketing relationship of whatever, what was the purpose of that web content. And those were the days when, somebody would come to me and they'd say, hey, look, there's this thing called Facebook, or there's this thing called Twitter or YouTube, and can you just figure out what we need to do with that? And then smartphones came around, and it just evolved a little bit. It was, hey, we need an iPhone app. And I'm like, what for? And they're like, I don't know. You need to figure that out, but we just need one. And then iPads came out, and it's like, we need an app for that too. So just investigate. Go figure out what we need to do with that. And so it became a question of me learning how tactics fit into strategies, especially with the digital focus. And so I was spending less and less time actually on web content and web design and more on learning these new channels and understanding what their value is. And then I'd be presenting that back to others in the organization. And so that's kind of where I cut my teeth with social media as well, and understanding how a mobile app, for instance, might fit into a strategy. And then I went into, for about the last 5 years, I had been I left the medical device world and I started consulting, and that was a great opportunity. I've learned so much since doing that. I've done it full time a couple of times, and then in the middle of that, for about 3 years, I was building the digital marketing team at Phoenix Children's Hospital. So yeah, so from there, I guess there were a lot of things we learned there as well, and one of them was the demand of consumers for health information in digital channels. And one thing that I will always probably point back to was a success that we had by periscoping a surgery, a children's surgery, videoing it live and having the surgical coordinator in a room down from the OR answering questions that people were posting in real time, and a couple of us in the OR filming it on a little iPad mini at the time. Nothing special, but it was the first week that we knew of anyone actually periscoping, or so live streaming any kind of pediatric surgery, and we learned so much from that. In fact, one of the things we learned was how successful it was, and how much, like I said, how much demand there was for it. And so based on that, we actually started a Facebook Live series where we were interviewing doctors of different specialties. At one point, it was once a week. It was about 25 to 30 minutes. Parents, in this case, were the audience. They were asking questions. Well, what about my kid? This, and this. And we found a way to do it. I guess the biggest takeaway is that we found a way to do it where we knew we were helping connect people with their answers that they were looking for in a way that didn't violate anything about HIPAA, about privacy laws, about anything. We were able to do it in a secure, private way that, we just knew HIPAA didn't have to be an obstacle to putting out relevant content. So I think that was the biggest lesson we learned from that. And so then anyway, that was about 3 years. And then for the last year or so, I've been consulting again.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to What's My Tagline, and my guest today is Jared Johnson, healthcare marketer, brand builder, and podcaster. So Jared, you're an author. You wrote a book, Connect the Docs, D-O-C-S, Put Digital Health into Practice. What's the book about?
So Connect the Docs was a bit of a side project, and it wasn't even on my radar for a while. So about 4 years ago, I started my first podcast, Health IT Marketer, and it was mostly focused on the B2B and digital health space, where I'd be interviewing those who were either marketing to marketing digital health or being marketed to. So I ended up speaking with and interviewing a lot of providers on the podcast as well, and I'd ask them, what they cared about, basically. That was my goal. And within the first few months, I learned that a lot of providers were interested in digital health, but in their case, they didn't know what that first step should be, and what does that mean? Like, if we're willing to try it, we don't know what to do next. And so I saw that as an opportunity, and the more interviews that kind of fell along these same themes, some weren't even providers, some were others in organizations who just thought, we're trying to implement something in our space, in our health system or whatnot, and we just don't know exactly what that next step needs to be. So the book, the book was, the thought behind it was, let me take some of those podcast interviews, let me put them together, kind of like a greatest hits album, essentially.
Oh.
and let's reach an audience that haven't connected with the podcast yet, that just don't know about it yet. And so I took about 20 of those interviews, and about half of them were from physicians, and the other half were from just other industry thought leaders. They were everyone mostly in a health IT or digital health role that was somewhat well known, that would publish things on a regular basis, and that was one of the reasons I would typically have somebody on the program, is if they've already put thoughts out there into the world, and that they're publishing some kind of content themselves, whether it was on a social media channel or a blog or whatnot. And I started asking them all some very similar questions, and I realized that question of, like, what do we do next? Like, how do we actually implement digital health? In their case, it wasn't necessarily market to us more. It was, no, we actually need this is an evidence-based institution, right? So we need to see how others would do it. And so some of these interviews were with folks like Dr. Danny Sands, who is out of he practices out of New York, but a lot of people have heard of ePatient Dave DeBronkart, so
Sure.
just ePatient Dave, and Dr. Sands is ePatient Dave's primary care physician. And he explained to us, he kind of walked us through, like, here's how when I sit down, when Dave comes in for his appointment, or whoever it is, here's how I interact with them. And the way that he walked us through it just felt like very revelatory at the time. It was like, this probably shouldn't sound like rocket science, but it's amazing the difference that he was explaining about how he would literally turn the computer screen so that the patient could see the notes he was putting in there, because he wanted them to see those notes. He didn't want to hide it. He wanted that to be part of the interaction. So if they had any questions, he could answer them instead of just trying to rush from patient to patient. A lot of the things that we have kind of complaints about as patients. So there were tons of stories like that from the guests. And so the book is really just, we took those interviews, got them transcribed, and then kind of cleaned them up, and then worked with each of those contributors, got their permission, everyone but one, which I was just blown away. I was like,
That's amazing.
Yeah, I was like, there's this harebrained idea. People are probably going to be like, you're crazy, which I'm used to, right? And I just kind of, sometimes I don't even mind it anymore. But all but one got back to me, and the other one wasn't necessarily no. They just never got back to me. So it was thrilling to be able to put it together. It's had a great reception because it kind of ties those two worlds together, of the clinical and non-clinical worlds, of these two different views of how they use things like an electronic health record or a remote monitoring app or social media. I had Dr. Justin Smith, who's known by at the Doc Smitty on Instagram, on Twitter. He's got a blog. He's really well known, and it's the stuff he's able to do, the information he's able to get out there just by having these social media channels proactively and trying to educate patients. It's amazing. So I learned a lot by putting it together, but that was the goal, is to really truly help serve as a handbook for clinicians to understand how to take those first steps with digital health.
And sort of that anecdotal bent to that too, I think, is really great, because now we're talking about storytelling. We're talking about like the Malcolm Gladwell kind of book, right, where it's each chapter is its own little story, but you're weaving these themes throughout the entire, connecting the dots, right? You're weaving a particular theme through the entire book and narrative.
Right, and that was the goal. There were some that I wanted to actually include in it, and I realized they kind of didn't fit that theme. They were still good in and of themselves, but they weren't going to fit that theme, and so for those reasons, those ones got left off.
Right, and I learned something. I didn't realize you had a podcast before the healthcare wrap.
Yes, so that one, I would say I did that one for about a little over a year. And then as my responsibilities with the hospital took hold, I didn't really have as much of a place, and I wasn't consulting full-time anyway to be able to really answer the types of feedback and questions that we got from that kind of content. And so I put that on hold. And the funny thing is that I want to say probably a year and a half later, I was a guest on Janet Kennedy's podcast, Get Social Health. And on the air, she was like, you haven't been podcasting for a while, and I just want to challenge you to get back on the airwaves. Like, find some reason to get back out there. She said, I think that'd be good for you. And I took that as a challenge. And I thought to myself, okay, well, if I do another podcast, what would it be like, and how would it be different, and so forth. And so there was a period of time I didn't know, if I'd be able to get back out there. But about a year and a half ago, I was able to finally put those pieces together and get the healthcare wrap going, and it's been crazy ever since.
Yeah, and so I've obviously listened to your show. Tell our audience about the show. I know you actually have a lot of providers on your show and hospitals. So what is healthcare wrap about? If a provider out there, a hospital, is on iTunes and searching for healthcare wrap and starts listening to your podcast, what can they expect?
So what they can expect is an understanding of how to use digital tools, especially marketing, of how to engage consumers in the right way, right? So we like to say we're challenging the status quo of how healthcare marketing has been done in the past. So the traditional media buying, advertising as the main aspects, and then kind of not really actually engaging consumers with digital channels anymore. That we're talking about how to overcome that and how to really change that so that we are actually marketing in an effective way. And sometimes that does have to do with folks like I've had Dr. Austin Chang on there, who was the very first. This was just earlier this year, which it's interesting. It's taken this long to have this as a position, but he was the very first, chief medical social media officer at a major hospital, and so that's part of his role.
Really, Chief Medical Social Media, CMSMO.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yes. I know. I had to kind of spell it out in my mind before.
I had to think about that for a second, right? CMSMO. That's a first for me. I have not heard of it, so this is happening then.
It is, and so he's with Jefferson Health out in the Philadelphia area, and part of his role is to what I've seen. I've been following him. I'd say Instagram is probably his number one place to engage. He's predominantly engaging with other providers to help them understand the value of social media and how to use it in a peer-to-peer setting. So he'll ask questions. He'll have a photo of something that was taken like after a procedure's done, not of the patient, but like there in the OR, just kind of standing with one of the one of the pieces of equipment that was used or something like that, and then he'll ask a question, hey, how would you guys have dealt with this challenge that came up in this procedure? And he knows how to do it in the right way, to not violate any privacy, of course. And it just provides a different dialogue. It's a dialogue that other providers have started to engage in as well, like Dr. Smith, who I mentioned earlier. Some have been doing it for years, and they used to be looked at like they were kind of a little crazy from their peers, and now their peers are like, no, really, how do we do this? And so I feel like that's part of that's one side of the equation that we talk about on the program. A lot of times we just get really granular and we talk about like, let's take a step back, like what can healthcare do and how should we be marketing it? And then we'll talk about digital content. We'll focus on a certain channel, and we will bring in a guest and we'll say, how do we, how do you use Instagram to actually connect with a patient, and why should we care about it? And how is that different than things used to be? Because I feel like the entire way that we see marketing has flipped on its head, and we have to be comfortable being able to connect with people in where they are. We've got to connect, and it's not just as simple as, okay, let's go put out some content in those channels and then still focus all of our time on our U.S. News and World Report rankings and go put all of our marketing effort into that. So we have really, really interesting open dialogues on the podcast, and the whole thought was it was Peter Balistreri is my co-host, and we had it for a number of months before we even had any guests on, and now we'll have guests most weeks. And even in those early weeks, we talked a lot. It was just a dialogue of like, really, if digital is transforming everything about healthcare, and if being consumer-centric is a new approach to healthcare, how do we do those things? And we don't necessarily have all the answers, but we are learning them one thing at a time. And so it's been a blast. And then the rap part of it really was just a kind of a way to have a little fun with it, because we wanted a little different angle on it. And so one of the segments of each program is literally called the Rap Battle, where we don't actually rap against each other, but we say we're kind of we're kind of battling the status quo of healthcare marketing, right? And so then we have other segments and things every now and then. Every now and then there are additional raps in it as well. Like you mentioned the Hitnik one that we did.
I did.
So it's part of it, and I guess just that thought of kind of that freestyle approach to rap. We're mostly old school rap. I couldn't tell you who's on the rap charts these days, but so it's back when rap was fun.
Back when rap was fun. It's really interesting. I think that even just getting back to your tagline about the help and the hope and not the hype. I think some of the things that you're talking about, and how doctors and hospitals too. Again, I've I've listened to a number of your podcasts, how they are using social media and the digital environment not to create more walls between them and their patients and their community, right, and the consumer, but tearing down that wall. I know physicians are beginning to embrace Instagram. Obviously, hospitals and physicians have been on Facebook for quite a while, but take it beyond just the marketing message of, this is what we do, this is what we do at the hospital, this is how successful we were, this is what we did, and really, bring these providers front and center, right?
Absolutely. That is the goal. The providers ought to be the ones who are kind of the focus, because that's who typically a healthcare encounter is with. So let's use that for what it's worth. Let's figure out what would make somebody want to come and schedule an appointment with a certain provider. Let's get that information out there. Let's make sure they know how to connect with that person and give them the chance that's most likely to help them realize that this is the right provider for them.
Yeah. Jared, believe it or not, we are all out of time.
That is crazy. See, this stuff goes super fast, doesn't it?
It does go fast. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. You can learn more about Jared Johnson on LinkedIn and follow him on Twitter at Jared Piano. And of course, check out his podcast, Healthcare Wrap. You can share your thoughts or comments about the show on Twitter at #What'sMyTagline, or visit the program page on healthcarenowradio.com. Reach out to me on Twitter at Carol Flagg, or email me at carol@healthcarenowradio.com. It all makes sense now. You can now listen to all the great programming on our station on your Amazon Echo or Google. Just ask your favorite assistant to play Healthcare Now radio station. And of course, if you listen to the podcast of our shows on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcast channel is, be sure to like us and give us a rating. Until next time, I'm Carol Flagg, and I want to know, what's your tagline?